We are live. Welcome to today's Elevate series. My name is Tziporah from TziporahIntimacy.com, and today I am here as your host and ambassador to the Elevate series. I am here today with three friends and very special guests. I'm very excited. I was taking notes before we get on this call because I'm really excited for the topics that we're going to explore on trauma-based practices, trauma-informed practices, relationships, social justice, and I believe that's just going to open up the door to so much amazing dialogue and rich conversation. Before I get to introducing our special guest and handing the baton over to them, I just want to speak a little bit into what this series is. And so the Elevate series is I like to call it a co-creation of 20 plus global leaders. And originally it was set to go forth for 3 weeks, and we're entering past a month. And my intention is to go as long as people continue to show up. And I believe our intentions, and one of my intentions when I started this was to create this space, this platform where we can have inspiring, impactful, and real conversations that we're offering up resources and ways of returning back to our center and connection and being in these thriving relationships in the world, not just through crisis, but beyond it in our own personal lives. So, on that note, I would like to announce our special guest, and we have Shelby Lay. We have therapist, coach, and founder of Creating Safer Space for Facilitators Worldwide. We have Dr. Ava Brown, a family and sex therapist, and Ashley Rose, social worker, transpersonal counselor, and artist. But what I want to do now, and I love this part, is just kind of handing the baton over to you. And I say we're going to go popcorn style. And that means whoever feels called to just drop in to share more about you, your work in the world, and specifically, what is your yes? What is your passion behind why you do what you do in your work?
I'll jump right in.
Okay.
So there's so many reasons why I feel like I answer this question different every single time. It depends on the day and what kind of healing I'm doing in my own heart and my own body and what I'm seeing in my clients. And almost always the inspiration is fueled by what I'm seeing in my clients and my students and just how they are making such an impact in the world. And as you just shared, Tziporah, my real passion and my mission is around creating safer spaces everywhere. And the amount of tenderness I feel and how touched I feel when I hear stories about people really implementing these ideas and this work into their sessions, into their classes, into healthcare offices, and hearing that people are actually receiving the healing, the gifts that are being offered in a way that they never were able to before. I'm getting goosebumps right now just thinking about it. Every time I'm like, this is why I do what I do. And I don't how I got into this was just out of a pure act of rebellion, just being so pissed at how poorly I felt held in spaces for so long, and just wanting to make an impact for one other person, to be able to walk into some space and feel held, feel cared for, feel seen, feel like things were moving slow enough to really feel like they mattered and they could show up with every single part of themselves. And so knowing that I get to share this with my clients and my students, and then they take it out into the world, or just, one-on-one, the people I impact, it just keeps me going. And it makes me so happy to know that the world is feeling a little gentler on us very sensitive souls, one person at a time.
Oh, beautiful. Thanks for being here. And I just want to share a little bit. Last time I've seen Shelby was, you said 50, it's about 15 years ago. We lived in the same town and we were part of the same community. And I thought of you, like you just popped into my mind when it came to this conversation. And this is the first time we've reconnected since that time. So I'm excited that you're with us and doing what you're doing in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. You were a serious inspiration for me in facilitating groups. So thank you.
Okay, well, I'll introduce myself. My name's Ashley, and I think I've always been drawn from a very young age to working in the healing arts. And I think a lot of healers would agree that it tends to be a calling, but it also is a product of your own given circumstances, whether it's your family of origin or like the situations you find yourself in for some reason. I'm not sure who among our viewership subscribes to sort of like the unfolding of what's written on our souls versus the sort of like tabula rasa view of the world. But I certainly felt from a young age, I was in these unique circumstances where I tended to be the grounding force and the one who wanted to bring everyone in from the fringes and who wanted to hold space for threshold experiences, moments of alchemy, and being in those groundbreaking moments with people has been pivotal in all aspects of my life. So, yeah, I started honestly with A Course in Miracles very early. Was the first book that really felt resonant with me when I was a teenager, and then from there, I just studied like rites of passage and ritual and how our inner natures interact with outer nature and what the role of community and the elements are in our own healing and our sense of belonging, and studied trauma and became a therapist. And now I've been doing frontline work. I'm currently working in harm reduction and in the downtown east side, specifically in family reunification work. So I think as ever, the deepest question in my heart is how can we get everyone, how can we support everyone when they're coming from such a diverse streams of backgrounds, and so that we can feel unified and we have a sense of place together and we have very rich communities. So my heart call is kind of keeping everyone in the same basket with diversity. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm excited to drop more into that conversation about what's happening in this world that many of us don't see. You know, out in the front line she speaks of the east side. She's up in Vancouver. Ashley, you're in Vancouver, Canada. And so I'm excited to drop into that as our conversation goes on. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I kind of started in my 20s. I was an executive director with Passion Parties. Anyone familiar with Passion Parties?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how I started. And I was, really teaching women sexual education at the time. And for about 9 years, I loved working in the company. I loved working with women. I had a large team, and it was really hard for me to walk away from all of them, but I did because there was a pivotal point in my Passion Parties lifetime that when I would take orders, when I would take orders for women for enhancing their bedroom life and so forth, they would usually end up telling me, Eva, I am not happy in my relationship. I'm not communicating. I'm feeling triggered. They had all these things that were happening, and I just felt so inadequate is the word, inadequate in terms of being able to serve them. Yes, I knew what kind of lubricant would be better for the bedroom if you were having pain. Yes, I knew this lotion would be better for you, right? I knew stuff about my product, but I didn't know how to help them. So my passion for working with couples got fueled by that experience, which is why I'm sharing it with all of you. So I then, decided to stop Passion Parties completely, go get my master's and my PhD and do the academic world for a while. I'm so glad I'm out of that world. But, there's definitely a reason for academics, and continuing to move research forward and so forth. And I think that they do an amazing job. But for me, I really like working in the trenches. I like to get my feet wet, and I like to normalize, my big thing with couples is normalizing what's going on in their lives. A lot of them think that there's something wrong with me or us in our relationship because we can't communicate. Well, no, we just didn't learn how to communicate intimately to foster that intimate connection, in a relationship that's needed. We just didn't learn that, right? We didn't know that most of our triggers, our trauma triggers, happen between the ages of 0 to 20 to 25 because the brain's not fully developed, So it's like, that's just a very important aspect of my work, working with couples to normalize. Because when I was working with these ladies, I think the biggest takeaway for me during that time when I was in my 20s was they thought they weren't normal, that they were having, problems in their relationship that no one else had. And so for me, my message is all about normalizing and helping couples really tune in and live a turned on, lifestyle together. That's my main mission globally. We're not doing it for the small fishes. We really want to make an impact everywhere, because my bigger goal, and I'll end here, my bigger goal is to see every single couple in a conscious, awake partnership. Like, that totally drives me wild. So that's what my goal is. And I'll be doing that before I die. That's for sure. So that's it about me, guys.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for doing what you do, all of you. And the world's a better place, in my opinion. So that's great. So I'm going to share a little bit about me and why I'm here and my passions in the world. And like I said, I'm the founder of the supportintimacy.com. I am an intimacy, communication, breathwork specialist. And when I think about my why and what I do, I always go back to my childhood, right? I think of like, wow, like I want to create these safe spaces for people out of maybe what I didn't get that felt safe for me as a child. And envisioning people communicating compassionately and being able to hold space for each other in relationship, being able to live in such an embodied way that we always feel intimately connected with everything around us, and we're not attached to, like, in today's world of ice, where we're in shelter in place, some of us alone, that we're not attached to that idea that we need another physical body to feel that level of connection. And I think it all comes back to feeling safe in the body. I am the author of Revolutionizing Intimacy, Navigating Connection in a Disconnected World. And truly, I see it's all about building bridges, right? Like that, building bridges with more intimacy, with more compassion on the planet, in order to really deepen. Often I say relationship, but I'm not even going to say that. I want to say deepen human connection. Because even what's our definition of what relationship is? To me, it's like for humanity. So as we continue the conversation, I want to go deeper, but I want to start with you all personally. I want to know, in present day, like this week, present moment in life, what do you see has been the forefront in your personal life, in the conversations you're having, with the conversations with your friends or family, and maybe professionally as well? Like, is there a theme there for all of you?
I'll jump
on
in.
in.
Yeah. So I feel like most of my close people are all kind of in a similar industry. And the first word that popped into my mind when you asked that was regulation. So many people are learning about this word that folks are just throwing around left and right, and learning how to kind of come into their center and into their ground, into their hearts and in their bodies in a way that feels like it brings more peace and more contentment. And I'm noticing that more and more people are feeling dedicated and devoted to peace above anything else. And that can mean so many things. It might be joy for someone or happiness for someone, but I hear this is a time just where people are like, actually, I don't want to live how I used to live, pushing and striving and comparing and doubting and like allowing the insecurities to get the best of me and feeling anxious. And a lot of those things are getting looked at right now and is like, oh, and I look at everything through the nervous system. So most of my people are talking to me about that, but it's like, okay, and so how do we bring that peace if we're so committed to loving ourselves in this way? How are we supporting ourselves, and how are we supporting each other to really be walking our talks, to be doing what we teach and what we share with others, and showing up fully embracing everything, every single moment with absolute permission. And so right now, during this COVID epidemic, it's like, that means meeting the grief with absolute willingness to be present with it, to have some kindness and compassion with it. That means meeting the elation. You know, so many people are like, this is the first time in my life I have ever gotten this much space to myself to really get to know myself or nature. You know, it means meeting, feeling alone and realizing I'm okay for the first time, and having this sense of everything's welcome. And that comes in so many different forms for so many different people. But I'm hearing themes of like compassion, of welcoming everything, of not being willing to cope in our old ways, and claiming peace, and that's like self-love, compassion, happiness, and prioritizing that above all else. And I think that's because I know for me, I'm going, oh, this is actually a wake up moment where I really have a choice and I really get to look at stuff. And I don't have to keep saying yes to the things that I was saying yes to because it was a big should. And a lot is falling away and life is slowing down. And this reminds me of that word regulation again, which is, for me, it's, can I handle the slowness? Can I handle the peace? Am I able to tolerate feeling this much ease in my system? Because for me, I'm used to running on a lot of hypervigilance, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of adrenaline. And when I'm regulated, I can breathe, I can feel the earth beneath me, I can see your faces in front of me, I can see the tree outside, and I can receive life. I can receive all of the things that I've just been craving being able to connect with. But my nervous system was like, I can't because it's not safe. And so now it's, oh, there's a little bit of space to receive safety, to allow myself to be with the discomfort maybe of all the things I've been wanting, but not knowing how and not able to give, through doing all the things that bring me into regulation. And maybe we'll talk about that later.
Absolutely, we're going there. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can relate, and I just want to recap that, and how the slowness is opening up those doors, right, where we possibly wouldn't have gone before. I relate to the hypervigilance and, you know, being locked down in Southern California right now, the stress factors of just the busyness in general, of the energy down here, and giving ourselves permission, right, in the slowness to, like, oh, like, I'm going to sit in my tent and do our podcast, our live, and nourish our own bodies. So thank you. And we're going to dive deeper into the self-regulation and maybe offer some practices as we go on in this conversation. So thank you, Shelby.
Yeah, thanks.
Who's next?
I think for me, I definitely did a lot of observation of self, and I've learned a lot about myself with these unique circumstances. But if there was a commonality, it was that there was no theme for me. Just talking to people across the world, different friends in different countries, and in very vastly different class systems and access to family, community, resources, all of those things meant that everyone is having such different reactions. You know, I had a friend who had recently got a job posting in a different country, and she had to be repatriated, and it changed her entire life. She thought she would be away for years. Another friend of mine is experiencing a reignition of her panic attacks. So crowds have become the impactful quotient. Some other friends of mine who are very afraid about the civil liberties piece, or things that they were working on in terms of social justice action have now been paused. I can speak a little bit less to the actual feeling of being quarantined because I've actually worked more. And so I haven't actually had that feeling of rest. But what I did notice about myself is that I've actually found this a more peaceful time for me because of all the systems that have been, because of the slow element that everyone has spoken about. And I also learned how deeply I compartmentalize. So I think part of anyone unpacking, whether they feel very agitated or sort of in trauma terminology, the hyper end of the spectrum, or the hypo, or they're underreacting and there's a sluggishness in their system, or there's a hiding, or there's a muting behavior with alcohol, whatever you're noticing in your system, if you can link it back to your family of origin or to a central theme that might be the most activating for your system, or that you're becoming in reaction to, I think it really helps unpack those things. So for myself, because I work in crisis so much, I really started to understand that my reactions have become so secondary that I'll probably feel all of this. If we do renormalize, I'll probably be feeling a lot of things after the fact, not right now. But I do think that there is one central thing that I believe might be a part of everyone feeling slightly more vulnerable, is there's a sort of collective trauma I think we always have in the back of our minds, an awareness that maybe we don't fully always know how to take care of each other. And perhaps we're vulnerable as a society because some people are always left out and some people are always the ones who will be focused on first. So I think there's an underlying threat to our system, knowing that that our society hasn't necessarily matured to not prioritize itself. It's very self-centric. We live in a capitalist framework, so there's a natural flow towards that self-centrism. And so part of one of the trauma modalities that I really love, called trauma incident reduction, one of the things it speaks to is something called flows of causation. And what they found studying trauma is that most people, when they're receiving services for a traumatic event or underlying trauma that they've experienced in their life, it doesn't heal. Even if they integrate part of that, it doesn't heal as positively as when they also acknowledge a perpetration in their own life that they've enacted on another, and also where they acknowledge how society has impacted them. So there's all these different flows, and it seems as though we tend to integrate more powerfully when we understand the complex sort of network of exchanges of trauma and acceptance and love that we seem to be interacting with the entire time. So I just want to invite that side of the conversation in terms of, there's stress is political, and a sense of calm is a political thing. Not everyone is standing on the same ground. So there are politics to these things that also need to be unpacked in order for us to really find a way to take care of people from such diverse backgrounds. So.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, it's such a potent piece to really acknowledge the diversity, and that I know you and I speak a lot one-on-one, and what fascinates me, that even if I didn't get this information, I might lack an awareness of it. Is that how we're not all in the same boat right now. Like, we're not all experiencing this the same way, and even just from country to country. Like, I go through strange sensations just when I talk to my friends in Canada, because I'm in the States. And of course, if someone talked to me in the States
So
from
different.
another country, they'd also have a whole different relationship. And it's just like, wow, like, yeah, there's so many different levels to this, and the intricacy and the importance of unpacking that. And even like I admit, like, how, right? There's so many layers when it comes to unpacking this on a global level to address that collective trauma. And I appreciate this. God, we can talk for hours, all of us, I think, on this. I appreciate this
Yes.
conversation and just opening up greater curiosity. So thank you.
Mhm.
All right. So I was actually so immersed in everyone's answers. I believe the question was, how's COVID been for you during this time, right?
Well, like, what's alive for you today and in your conversations? And yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can tell you personally that I went through my own trauma, I think, in this experience. I think at first I was in like a state of shock because everything just really closed down so quickly, right? And then I remember feeling very worried and like even angry a little bit. I was cycling through some emotions. And for a while there, I think I might have dissociated really for a moment because there was so much news and so much mail and so many press conferences that I was watching, and I felt very inundated. But at the same time, I'm one of those people that likes to know what's happening, in the world. And, it's a little bit anxiety about, the uncertainty of where we're going and things like that. So I always wanted to watch those conferences. But midway through quarantine, I got to the point where I was really feeling all of my emotions really start to come up. Like, it wasn't just getting information and then dissociating the emotion, or, just watching and watching and watching. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I did it for like a half an hour a day. It's not like I was on there all day, but for me, I never watch the news. I'm not one of those people to be really, really engaged with politics. But when this happened, I thought to myself, well, this is something that I probably should, really engage in. And so midway through, I remember waking up one morning and all of a sudden I just started crying, right? Tears came and I really felt emotional. And I even said to my husband, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm just crying, and he's like, honey, the world is completely shut down and your business, no one's at the private practice, because I run a private practice in Fort Lauderdale. And so none of my team is there anymore, so now I'm working at home and my dog's at my feet, my dog's barking, so I got all that stuff going on, right? But it was that moment where I said to myself, I need to start to reevaluate and reassess how we're going to be moving forward, because the quarantine didn't end as quick as I thought it would, right? I mean, I really thought, okay, maybe 4 weeks, and then we're going months now, So I started to get really, curious after I went through my emotional release, right? It was very cathartic. And so I stopped watching the conferences and I started thinking about how am I going to be moving forward, with my business, with my life, working with my couples, And thank God, all of my couples continued to work with me through video camera, which is amazing. I'm actually busier now than I was before. And I had a really busy, thriving practice before. And I think it's just because more couples, when they go through this quarantine experience, they got triggers popping off one and then the next. And, they don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to be in the same house for 12 hours a day with all 5 of their family members when they're used to having, 8, 9 hours out of the home. So it's a big transition, and I'm grateful for my own experience with it, because I don't think I'd be able to serve my couples in the way that I've been able to going through. Like, if I just completely dissociated into a bubble somewhere, I don't think I'd be grounded in what a lot of people are going through. And, for me, money's not a problem, but I'm thinking about all the people that are having money problems and can't work. And, really what's happening, in my opinion, is that we're going through a lot of loss and a lot of grief in the way that our communities and the way that our societies are living our day-to-day life. I watch my husband go into Publix with a full-on mask because we live in South Florida. It's a pretty heavy area, everyone's like masked up and, with their gloves on. And I have to take a deep breath, like, wow, like, what am I watching here? And, so it's also this trust with politics. Can you trust politics? Politics? That's traumatic enough just watching it. Right.
Yeah.
So that's what's in my field, ladies.
Thank you. What I appreciate about all of you, like this panel today, is, in my interpretation, is we all have the ability, or we choose to go into the experience of feeling and then teach from that place, right? And
right.
And then, as we go deeper into trauma right now, I want to relate to something that I went through last night, and it's pertaining to the politics. I do not get into politics.
Mhm.
I,
Yeah.
I don't watch news. I don't. It's not healthy for my nervous system, and it's just noise for me because I recognize for myself, as long as I'm aware,
Right.
then I need to just, my job is to stay centered and grounded. So when it's time to take action, I can actually take action.
Mhm.
I just need to be aware enough, but that's all I need. But last night or it was this morning or last night, I saw something about the impacts on farming and food. Like it was just going deeper into what often we're not paying attention to right now.
Mhm.
And my whole system was just like, oh my God, I need to be in the forest with a bunch of people in community, with tribe, growing food, off grid, away from this cement jungle. And I find that might be potentially coming up for a lot of people is, how do we live today? How have we been living? It definitely has
Right.
those ideas running through me. And what is the future? Because I can create it now. What is it going to take as a collective to start to make some maybe very uncomfortable, like, I'm not saying, like, for me things would be super uncomfortable and challenging. It's just like, how am I going to deal with it? How am I going to do that kind of thing? um, but knowing that, I believe we're at this pivot point, and there's just so many greater things happening that we're all so unaware of, that how can we be prepared in the place of maybe feeling the impacts of trauma from the noise, right? The noise that's happening, from the politics, from the stories. And so, I often say when I'm working, like when I talk of trauma, it's so relative, right? Because I say a child getting a teddy bear ripped out of their arms at a young age, depending on what was happening around them, how old they were, but what was happening in their surroundings and in their family environment, that could impact the way they relate as an adult, their ability to regulate.
Mhm.
And so, I don't even like to box in that term trauma, but we know it's so vast. And
Yeah.
so let's just drop into that for each of us. Let's just kind of dive into, like, what ways, okay, so what ways more so unconsciously that aren't obvious, because I want to bring up the stuff that aren't obvious to the world right now, that trauma itself can be like coming up to the surface for people, from having different coping mechanisms. You
Yeah.
think about two people living in a house together or a family, and then all of a sudden not being able to talk because they're getting
Mhm.
and triggered and their traumas are coming up to their nervous system is shaking and rattled. And no matter how much love is there, they might just have different coping styles because of their story. And so that's all I'm going to say. Just things that aren't so obvious right now, whatever comes to you, to share with the world right now when it comes to trauma and how it might be showing up in the less obvious ways.
I'd love to just jump in and define trauma a little bit, because we're all using the word in a bit of different ways. And I think that it would be helpful for folks listening who may not use it so freely to just
Awesome.
understand a little bit about how I'll just say where I come from. Folks, I'm a trained psychotherapist, somatic psychotherapist, trauma specialist. And it's actually not the event. And you just spoke to that. It really has nothing to do with the event. So there's no way we can compare trauma. And a lot of us get stuck in, oh, I'm not allowed to feel this grief. I'm not allowed to feel this fear because others have it so much worse, and trauma actually is our whole system's response, our nervous system, our body, our heart, our mind, to the events that happen in our life. Could be event or a compilation of mini events. And then it's how we carry that through the world and how we come into relationship with ourselves and others and the environments around us. And it's what happens in our nervous systems. And so one of the questions you asked was like, how does that show up? And so two people might experience the same exact event, and one might walk away totally feeling unscathed, unimpacted, and another might walk away with a lot of anxiety for years and years and years, or maybe the rest of their life. Or One way that a lot of people cope when they're impacted by trauma is they go numb. They can't feel much. They really enjoy kind of checking out with TV or food or alcohol, drugs, sugar. Like it could be really anything. We can numb out with lots of different things. Certain people do an internal fight on themselves. They end up being in constant fight with themselves, criticizing themselves, judging themselves, really living under a lot of shame. I am bad. I am wrong. Others go for an external fight, constantly criticizing and judging others or actually physically fighting. Some folks have a chronic desire just to run, to flee, to get out of the situation, to shift where they are, to focus on something else constantly. And there's a trauma response that sometimes I mention, sometimes I don't. It's not a super official one, but people talk about fawning. And I think when we're stuck in our houses with other folks, one way we cope with trauma is we try to get the other person to like us. We tiptoe around them. We really don't want to upset them. And so we morph ourselves into these things, trying to fit what we think that they want so that conflict doesn't happen. And that's a really, really common response where we trade our authenticity for connection. And those are just a few. Some people go into freeze where they can't even barely move. Their whole body feels rigid. Some people go completely flat, exhausted, collapsed, tired. And again, it has nothing to do with the event. You could have a teddy bear ripped out of your hands, and just like you said, because of the environment, because of your temperament, because of the attachment to your primary caregiver or caregivers, your community, you might have a very resilient response and be fine, and you might be totally falling apart and for the rest of your life feel really impacted and hurt by things that remind you of that event. And our bodies respond too. Our breaths quicken. We tend to hold our breath when trauma happens, and we tend to keep that breath held for the rest of our life, and that can create chronic health conditions, chronic stress patterns. We say that trauma is essentially something so overwhelming that we can't manage in our systems. And that could mean anything to 3 different people standing there, a whole different spectrum. And so your question about how do we move forward when we're coping with all sorts of things in all sorts of ways? How do we step forward into this next chapter of our world together? I honestly have no idea. I have no idea other than listening deeply to each of our own wishes for ourselves and coming into alignment with our own values and our own desires, and just supporting each other one step at a time, as well as we can, given our circumstances, to learn how to kind of help each other instead of put our values and our opinions on everyone else. That's all I can say.
Wow. Thank you, Shelby. And thank you for diving into that piece on trauma. And I'm just going to continue off of something you shared, because you know my passion for breath. And yeah, I find that that breath itself is such a beautiful model, right? To show what's going on with our system. I know my particular work with breath work is watching in those places of fight, flight, or freeze when we experience those uncomfortable things, and everything for survival is just pulling up to our center. And I often like the simple term that, it's not the experience, but even our judgment of the experience that keeps it lodged into the memory. And that's something that we see often in breath work, is that constriction where I know, speaking to the viewers now and the listeners, is just watching where the breath is, constricted and contracted in the solar plexus, or pulled up into the chest or into the throat. And then the body, I know for me, it's this catch of, am I 10 steps ahead of my physical body in that place of urgency, right? Moving from that frazzled nervous system. And often the breath, if we can just tune into like, okay, so where's the constriction? Where's the contraction? And now can I just find that pause to even be still enough so my breath can regulate or even come deeper into my diaphragm and into my lower belly, which I call the inner earth, and just start to find opening. We found with specific cyclic breathing that we each have a conditioned breath pattern. And when we understand that breath pattern, we can then go in and start to not just breathe to shift the nervous system, but to actually change the breath pattern in a very gentle way to start to shift those deeper patterns that are, like you so beautifully said, that are lodged like in the body memory. So yes, to breath. Thank you. Thank you for all that information. Very powerful. And I just want you all to know, if you see me looking away, I just want to make this announcement here. My assistant had an emergency today. She usually is typing in the comments. So I'm doing my best right now to be with you and also type some of the stuff that you're speaking into as well. So know that.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
I think what comes up for me in this question is that crisis is so revealing of what's truly going on inside all of us. So it feels like a bit of like a turning up of a burner and a little bit of heat under us, um, and so it really reveals what's happening in the person, the family, the culture. And I think some of the things that we've been seeing have been pre-existing for such a long time, but not necessarily given the attention they deserve. So some of the themes that I've seen come up are, sort of domestic violence, and some some of the things that Eva was speaking to about what happens to people when they're so closely housed. How are we taking care of our elders? We're finding globally people are walking in on seniors' homes where there's people who've passed or people who have been absolutely neglected. So where are we at with our elders? Um, a lot of I have some Middle Eastern friends, and they're sort of calling out a lot of the prejudices around the hijab and the burqa, and saying, well, we're all considering this more safe when we have half of our face covered. So are you really just marginalizing our cultural and religious practices? There's an edge there now. In Vancouver, something that has been a long-standing issue is housing and homelessness, and that's part of the sector that I work in. And so it's really interesting seeing now that it's a concern for middle and upper middle class people, how that's changing the conversation, and everyone is getting a rental freeze. Whereas most people, if they've had a different life and experienced a lot of oppression, they're evicted and they're in a cycle that spins them out even further. There's no support there. So I saw a really clever meme that my coworker put out. She's Indigenous, and she's like, so it's one of those colored tiles. And she's like, so you're afraid of the government controlling you, whether you're going to have work and resources, and what the police might do to you. Relax, you've only been Indian for 1 month, And I thought that was really clever, right? Is kind of speaking to an experience of like, this is actually what I live with day to day. And so I think in all of those things, the fact that they're just identified and that's given the airtime, and that the sort of mainstream, or the people holding the money, or people holding the narrative even, or people holding the media, whatever that looks like in different contexts, that the voices are given to other situations and contexts and validated. And I also want to say a lot of really cool things are happening. Like we've seen the power of our own innovation and the creativity that can happen when we actually just decide to prioritize things. And like in the downtown east side specifically, social workers we've been very scared because we were already in the middle of a crisis with with fentanyl. So there's been a lot of people dying by the thousands, and we were worried about the ramifications of COVID happening concurrently. And miraculously, it hasn't been as big of an issue as we thought. However, we had been arguing for safe supply, so that's for a really long time, that there be some subsidized pharmaceutical equivalents of what people use on the streets, like street drugs, so that people have a chance to stabilize. And that has come forward in this unique time. So that's beautiful. We've also seen grants for sex workers so that they're not, because isolation functions so differently in that particular neighborhood in Vancouver. People not only can't isolate, but it's completely counterintuitive to the way that the interdependence of that community. So, we are learning, and there are new things coming. Now, once we get a bit more comfortable, I'm not sure how much of that will stick or if we'll keep pushing those edges, but I am excited by some of the things that have been raised, and I think we should keep going.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ava, do you remember the question?
No, I'm good. Yeah. I wrote it down this time. I got ahead of you. Okay. So I like to think of trauma as, it can be really acute, or it can be very chronic over long, long periods of time. So, for example, you guys brought up the teddy bear example. If that happened between the ages of 1 and 7 years old, when they're developing their personality, I mean, that's very much imprinted in their personality development, just that realizing that they can be rejected in an emotional state. And I really think it's just lack of, knowledge. I mean, I think the generations before us didn't know what trauma was because they were certainly traumatized. And I mean, let's just also talk about history too, in terms of trauma. The late 1800s, the early 1900s, all the way up to like 1950, there was so much trauma that was going on. Nevertheless, all the war that happened before any of us were born, right? And then we're coming into the Depression era, where there was a global depression, at least in the United States, right? And so there's so much trauma that our parents and our grandfathers and our grandmothers, multi-generational, have been through, and they didn't have a therapist. It's not like, hey, I can barely pay for my bills, or I can barely put food on the table here, unless, you had a family that you came from money and wealth and you really worked hard for it, which was not the majority of the population. And so I feel like we have this multi-generational ledger of trauma. And what I see with my couples is I have to do trauma awareness with my couples, and it's not about getting lost in the story or the experience of what happened. It's more about pinpointing, okay, what are the emotional traumas that you had with mom, brother, family, siblings, and then going up to grandparents even. And it's interesting because every single time I do that, and my theory of change is called conscious relationship mapping, right? So you're consciously mapping your relationship by understanding where you came from, what was your history, and where are you now, and how are we going to then change those trauma cycles or those patterns or those loops that we're in a trance about, like we have trauma loops that are actually playing out all the time. Every single one of us, even all of us here, we have this thing that we tell ourselves, right? And we go into this cycle. And I track this loop with my couples. I'm like, all right, let's figure out what loop you're living in. And when they figure it out, they're like, oh my God, that's so cool. Now what do we do? And I'm like, well, now you can pick how you want to choose. Now we can create a new cycle. Because once you see yourself and you get that mirror, and then you start to understand how that affected everyone else in your family when you do that emotional mapping, it's like, wow, I see it so clearly. They can't go back. It's not like they're caught up in a trigger or a trauma loop. A trauma trigger is what I call it, right? Like not feeling good enough. That happened way before you were married. Like, not being able to communicate. That happened in your family system, not being able to communicate about your emotions. I'm not the kind of person that talks about my feelings. That's vulnerable. That was cultural within your family system and also systemically throughout the world, right? So we're taking on like this whole new era of trauma in terms of our way of understanding what trauma really is now. It hasn't been 10 years ago even, they were just starting, maybe 20 years ago, people in the academics, they were like, okay, we know what trauma is. We have the war veterans are coming home with PTSD. That's what people thought trauma was. That's what people mostly associated to. Oh, you must be really screwed up if you have trauma. No, we all have it. And if we don't know, it's just like if you don't know about your history, if Americans don't know about the history and the Russians don't know about their history, guess what happens? We repeat it. over and over and over again, right? It's like we want to dissociate from all the war and all the pillage and all the lack of the starvation that has happened to be able to have world trade, literally, right? So as a mass collective. So, you know, there's so many things that are happening and so many things that are shifting right now, girls, that it lights my heart on fire for people to know that it's okay that you have a trauma and you can fix it. You can intervene in it. I believe that managing a trauma trigger is a lifetime thing, and then it gets less chronic, right? So you experience it as acute or chronic, and then over time, you're like, oh, my trigger of not being heard doesn't really get to me anymore, right? That was one of my big triggers, not being heard. I grew up in a Italian, Jewish, and Irish family system, you know, and I couldn't get a word in edgewise. It was, psh, 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 you know, so that's why I'm so polite to all of you. I'm like, oh, let everyone else go and I'll go at the end, you know. It's like, it's ingrained in me as a human to hear people and to listen to people and to give and hold space for them. And in a way that, you know, my family system didn't come from, you know, they didn't come from that culture. And, you know, it's just so beautiful to see all my couples learn about themselves and then create and manifest new ways of being with their partners. And I think that's what trauma does for us. I think it's a growth point. It's a terrible experience when it happens, but it's actually a jumping off point. And I find that couples that are fighting a lot, if you're fighting a lot, it's because you've hit an area where you need growth, personally or in your relationship, usually both, right? So just paying attention to how all of it, you know, informs your relationship and your life and your personal growth.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Yes. So I love that the trauma is a growth point, and hearing, you know, us all speak into that it's not a negative or a bad, but building, how do we build a relationship with our history, with these parts within us and collectively. And I always like to ask the question, how is this working for me? Right? Approach it in a different way. How is this working for me? And now I can choose something differently. So I know there's so many steps within that, because it's not that simple when we're in the midst of the fire and the chaos. And I have been there. But taking into consideration our time, we can go on for hours of this. I know that we can, but I really want all of you to leave some really pivotal, simple steps or practices for people, because this is a huge conversation and topic. So what is something that you would like to leave our viewers with today, but that pertains more to maybe a practice that has helped you, something that they can use in their daily life that helps them gain awareness of, wow, like, you know, I know for me, it's really easy to explore and go into self-inquiry and, okay, so what's my coping mechanism? What am I doing? I'm a geek when it comes to that. I love that stuff. So what are some simple practices that you might offer for people who have never explored that before?
I'll just stay with the pattern.
Perfect.
Something pivotal. Okay. You know, I'll offer two really, really, really simple things, because I think simple works best for me. If I try to devote myself to a big practice, I'll never do it. One is, if I'm having any emotion, if I'm having any reaction or feeling overwhelmed by anything, the whole spectrum, pleasant to unpleasant, just put my hand on my heart, put my hand on my belly, and say to myself, it makes so much sense that I'm feeling this way. To really honor and validate whatever it is, because so many of us are really good at trying to fix it, trying to figure it out, trying to like give advice, get advice, change it, make it different, make ourselves different, and make ourselves wrong for most emotions we experience. And so just placing hand on heart, hand on belly, it makes so much sense that I'm feeling this way. And the second one I'll do all day, every day, because I so forget how to take care of myself, even though most people would say I'm like a guru at it, is what is the most loving thing I can do in this moment? And usually I get lost. I'm like, oh, I could be going for a walk, or I could be journaling. I could call a friend. I could take a nap. When I'm trying to figure out how to do self-care for my nervous systems that's been so exhausted, I just have to take a moment, put a hand on my heart. What is the most loving thing I can do in this moment? It doesn't matter what I choose, but it just gives me a moment to listen. And I find that really supportive.
Thank you. Thank you. I love the invitation to stillness and self-compassion within that. Thank you. Yeah. And Shelby, I would love to hear where people can find you right now in the world. Your website, anything you want to share about that?
Sure. Yeah. I have a couple of websites. One is just my name, Shelby-Leigh, Leigh.com. And my creatingsaferspace.com website is my trauma awareness program for coaches, therapists, and facilitators of all kinds. And on my current website, we just started launching our second round of the embodied coaching experience program that is really beautiful. So if you're a coach, go check that out.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelby.
Yeah.
I think one of the most fascinating things for me in terms of finding how to work with my own system is when to apply structure and when to break it. Because I think there's really healthy ways where we can do sort of the healthy thing, whether it's take a bath or go for a walk. And sometimes it really is worth staying up too late and having a glass of wine and, going in the other direction. And I think finding that sweet spot for each of us is part of that, that whole system. Right now, for me, doing cardio is so valuable. So I think anything that gets you in your body is going to be helpful, because it just naturally helps discharge your nervous system, and it also gets us out of our heads. And I think we're all a bit prone to that. But more than anything, I think it's about innovating and doing the wrong thing and stepping back and finding what sort of pleases yourself, almost like you would a child. That didn't work. I didn't get the results that I wanted. So knowing where the experience you want to have and the goal that you have in terms of what is your version of thriving, I think is really important. So just be playful, and sometimes it might be worth connecting outwardly, and sometimes that's an avoidant measure, and so it's worth going inside. So I would say stay creative and know when to break your rules and when to uphold them.
Yes. Thank you, Ashley. Ashley, where can someone find you right now if they want to explore working with you? Could they find you on Facebook, or where can I send them?
Yeah, absolutely. Outside of roaming the downtown east side, if you want, actually, I did want to offer, if anyone out there feels like they need support, or if they want to establish their perfect sort of recipe for how to thrive in this time, and they feel like they could use a hand with that, I'm very comfortable if anyone wants to reach out to me on Facebook and let me know what you're experiencing and what you would like to be experiencing, and a bit about you. I'm happy to be there. And yeah, my first name's Ashley, my last name's Rose, and I'm just on Facebook.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley.
You're welcome.
Nice. Okay, cool. So I have something that I think might be helpful, and it's something that I do for myself. My human design is a projector. Are you guys familiar with human design at all? Okay. I'm not that familiar with it, but I'm learning. And what I've been learning about myself is I can't do 12, 13, 14-hour days anymore, basically, right? And I've learned that as a projector, I really have to conserve my energy. So it's looks like 4 or 5 hour work days, So I'm shifting into that. And as I've been shifting into that, because that's a total mindset shift for me, because I'm, alpha, let's get it done. So the idea of cutting off my work day is like, what? I have to go work out now. I love to work out. I love to have fun. But one of the things that for me has been really helpful with my work ethic is, what does your inner child want to do today, Eva? And why is that question so relevant? I think that people experience trauma because in a lot of ways, of course, there's extreme variations of that, but many of it surrounds this concept or idea that I wasn't prioritized in the way that I wanted to be prioritized, right? I wasn't loved in the way that I needed to be loved or cared for as a child, teenager, and in our brains, our brains are not really fully developed until 2025. So most of the stuff we're experiencing is suppressed in nature, especially if it's a very terrible situation and we don't know how to, we're not wise enough or, had many experiences enough to be able to figure out how to relate to that particular trauma, whether it be acute or chronic, right? So for me, just overall, when you're talking about trauma, it's just, I wasn't prioritized in the way that I wanted to be prioritized. So now as an adult, how can I prioritize that inner child, right? How can I make that child, that inner child, because we all have them. Some of us have, a 3-year-old version, a 6-year-old version of trauma, a teenager version of trauma. And then, some of us experience it later on in life, like a terrible accident or something. So, it's otherwise as adults, we can set boundaries and say, no, I don't want to live with you. Like this is abusive. I want to move from this house and I'm going to go buy myself a house. It's very different when you're a kid. You don't have control over the environment. So my recommendation is to ask your inner child every day, what's one thing that I can do to serve my inner child, right? And so for me, what does that look like? Sometimes that looks like skipping down the block with my dog. Sometimes that looks like jumping in the pool when it's freezing ice cold and I'm screaming at the top of my lungs because it's so cold. I don't know what it is, right? But my child likes to have fun and my inner child likes to go on adventures, that's for sure. So, and also she likes to make necklaces. I make necklaces as a hobby, right? So, whatever it is that you can do to step into that energy, that childlike essence in that energy, Nietzsche talks about the 3 levels of growth, right? So there's the camel, the lion, and then there is the child, the innocent child. And so the highest level of enlightenment is considered a child. And what does a child do? A child does what it wants. It's like, I want that toy, I want a hug, or I want food. I want it now, So it's about prioritizing yourself as if you were that inner child and really make a relationship with that inner child, make a relationship with it. A lot of us have a negative relationship. I used to have a negative relationship with my inner child for sure. I didn't talk very nicely to her. And so you want to show love. And in that love, you learn to self-accept. And so I challenge all of you guys to ask yourselves that question once a day. It's been great for me.
Yeah. I love that. Just getting into a relationship with our creativity. I heard you speak into creativity and that inner child and even all aspects of ourselves. We ignore them so much.
Yeah.
This is amazing, ladies. I could just speak with you all day on these topics. Last, 2 words of wisdom, just a quote, wisdom, something you just want to leave with people right now, with the viewers. 2 words.
I'll go.
I feel like
Love it. We broke
you, Eva?
Yeah.
Oh, then you're going for sure. Okay. Let's do this.
Look at you guys wanting me to stand in my power. I love it. So good. So the 2 words just be you, right? Be you, and find me at The Couples Doctor on Instagram now.
Right? Couples Doctor, so, you got it.
Yeah, you guys can find me there. But again, reach out and be yourself, right? I mean, for me, it's all about authenticity and then living in integrity, right? So authenticity, integrity, just be you and enjoy the ride.
What is your website?
Relationshiprevolutionaries.com. Yeah.
I feel like what I feel like saying is to remember that investing in each other is the wisest form of self-interest. That when we actually find a way to give that enlivens our spirit and also serves many people, it's a really great intersection, and then we can thrive and to worry a little less about ourselves.
Love it.
I thought of this quote I saw on someone's office one time. I am that through which this is passing.
Nice.
Can you repeat that? I'm going to type it for everybody.
I am that through which this is passing.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Very cool.
And I want to just remind people, my last words would be curious in the stillness. Be curious in every sensation that the body is feeling, because I do believe that those sensations and those feelings are a doorway to that vast infinite plane of who you are, undiscovered. Yeah. So thank you all for joining
Thank you.
and
Thanks, you guys.
for those listening, please look up these amazing humans, check them out and what they're offering in the world. If you want to talk more with me, you can reach me at supportintimacy.com. We put links to all of our contacts in the comments. So until soon again, ciao.
Thanks, Tziporah. Thanks, you guys.